Zariah Campbell had exactly 5 seconds to commit a crime that would either save a life or end her own. 5 seconds to drop the silver tray that had become an extension of her arm for the last 2 years. 5 seconds to cross the soundproofed expanse of the most expensive study in Seoul. 5 seconds to invade the personal space of the mute monster, a man who hadn't been touched by a subordinate in 3 years. She had to plunge her fingers into his mouth and pray he wouldn't snap her hand off. The man with the sharp jawline and the lethal reputation was slumped over his mahogany desk, his dark eyes wide and clouded with a sudden, violent onset of oxygen deprivation. He was even more terrifying up close. The way the high society elite of South Korea subtly shifted their gaze whenever he entered a room told Zariah everything she needed to know about Siwoo's power. "Stay with me," Zariah whispered, her voice a jarring intrusion into the suffocating silence of the penthouse. She pressed closer, her knees hitting the plush carpet as her hand slid past his teeth. The glowing teal light of the chip hidden under his tongue illuminated her caramel skin for a fraction of a heartbeat. Under his tongue, the cold digital metal hummed against her palm as she cleared his airway. His gaze locked onto hers, and for the first time in his silent reign, a flicker of something human, vulnerability dawned in those calculating eyes. "Biometric link established. User Zariah Campbell." The mechanical voice whispered through the room just as his hand clamped around her wrist like a vice. His grip was warm, controlled, and utterly possessive. "Have you?" His voice finally broke through the years of silence, quiet, raspy, and dangerously intimate. "Have you been looking for me, Zariah?" Under his tongue sat the secret of the Choi Syndicate, and Zariah had just accidentally stolen it. The silence that followed the mechanical chime of the biometric link was heavy, pressing against Zariah's eardrums like the weight of the deep ocean. She remained frozen, her fingers still hovering near Siwoo's lips, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This wasn't the invisible life she had spent 2 years perfecting. She was supposed to be the girl who polished the mahogany, not the one who held the digital pulse of an empire in the palm of her hand. Siwoo's grip on her wrist didn't loosen. If anything, it tightened, pulling her inches closer until she could smell the expensive sandalwood and sharp metallic tang of his skin. He took a long, shuddering breath, the first clear breath he had taken in years, and the color began to return to his sharp features. His gaze was no longer clouded. It was a dark, piercing abyss that seemed to read the very history of her fear. "What did you do?" he rasped. The voice was low, cracking from disuse like dry earth splitting under the sun, yet it carried an authority that made the room feel smaller. "You were dying," Zariah whispered, her voice trembling. I just saw you couldn't breathe. I didn't mean to trigger anything." She looked down at the glowing teal chip now resting quietly under the curve of his tongue. It hummed with a soft, rhythmic light that pulsed in sync with her own heartbeat. The realization hit her with sickening clarity. The device wasn't just a scrambler. By touching it during its emergency reset, she had become the biological key. The high-tech shroud that kept the mute monster invisible to the satellites of his enemies was now tethered to a Jamaican-American maid with $3 in her checking account. Siwoo's eyes moved to the door, then back to her. The calculating stillness returned to his face, that mask of icy control that had kept him alive in the viper's nest of Seoul's underworld. He didn't call for his guards. He didn't reach for the weapon Zariah knew was tucked into the shadow of his desk. Instead, he reached up, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a terrifyingly soft touch. "The link cannot be broken," he murmured, the words vibrating against her skin. "If you leave this room, the signal dies. If the signal dies, we both do." Zariah felt the world tilting. She thought of her mother's letters, of the debt she was so close to clearing, and of the invisible life she had just lost forever. She had come to Seoul to disappear, but by saving the man who never spoke, she had just become the only person the world would be looking for. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 2, where Siwoo explains the true nature of the chip and gives Zariah her first order as his new shadow? The heavy oak doors of the study clicked shut, but the sound was instantly drowned out by a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. Siwoo didn't take her to the servants' stairs or the service elevator she was accustomed to using. Instead, his hand, still locked firmly around her wrist, pressed a concealed panel behind a row of leather-bound books. A private elevator, sleek and lined with black obsidian, slid open. As the lift ascended toward the safe floor, the penthouse's highest and most restricted level, the silence between them was no longer empty. It was charged with the static of the biometric link. Zariah could feel a strange, tingling warmth spreading from her fingertips where she had touched the chip, a phantom pulse that mirrored the thrum of the elevator's motor. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass, a maid in a wrinkled apron standing next to a ghost who had finally found his breath. The elevator opened into a space that felt less like a home and more like a command center. Monitors lined the walls, displaying scrolling green code and satellite feeds of the Seoul skyline. Siwoo led her to the center of the room, where a circular glass table projected a holographic map of the city. Only here, in the heart of his fortress, did he finally release her wrist. Zariah rubbed the red marks on her skin, her eyes wide as she took in the sheer scale of the surveillance. "Why me?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "There must be a way to override it. A technician, a doctor, someone who actually belongs in this world." Siwoo turned to face her. The harsh light of the monitors cast deep shadows across his sharp jawline, making his dark eyes look like polished flint. He took a step toward her, closing the distance until she was backed against the glass table. He reached out, not to grab her this time, but to tilt her chin up, forcing her to look at him. The air in the room seemed to vanish as he leaned down, his lips hovering just inches from her ear. The teal glow from the chip under his tongue cast a faint ethereal light against her caramel skin. "There is no override for a soul bind, Zariah," he murmured. His voice was stronger now, though still carrying that haunting, raspy edge of a man returning from the dead. It was a sound that made her pulse skip, not out of fear, but out of a sudden, terrifying intimacy. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his expression unreadable and absolute. "From this moment, your life is the only shield I have," he said, the words heavy with the weight of an empire. "Don't leave my sight." The transition from ghost to guest of honor began with the sound of a buzzer and the arrival of 3 silent women carrying garment bags that cost more than Zariah's college tuition. To the rest of the Choi Syndicate, the sudden elevation of a maid was a scandal waiting to happen. To Siwoo, it was a tactical necessity. The biometric link meant that if Zariah was more than 10 feet away, his location would flare onto every rival radar in Seoul. He couldn't hide her in the servants' quarters anymore. He had to hide her in plain sight. Zariah stood in the center of the dressing suite, her breath hitching as the rough cotton of her uniform was replaced by the cool, liquid weight of charcoal gray silk. It was a power suit, sharp-shouldered and impeccably tailored to her curves, designed to command respect while concealing the tremor in her hands. One of the stylists stepped forward, deftly unpinning Zariah's natural curls and allowing them to frame her face in a sophisticated, voluminous halo that softened the severity of the outfit. Siwoo watched the transformation from the doorway, his silhouette framed by the amber glow of the hallway lights. He remained a statue of midnight and shadow, his gaze tracing the new line of her silhouette with a clinical yet lingering intensity. He stepped into the room, dismissing the stylist with a single sharp nod. "From this moment," he said, his voice regaining its gravelly strength. "You are no longer Zariah Campbell, the girl who cleans the marble. You are the consultant from the London branch. You are my special strategist. You are the only person whose word carries my seal." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a slender silver earpiece, leaning in to hook it behind her ear. The proximity was intoxicating. She could see the faint pulse in her neck and the way the teal light under his tongue flickered as he spoke. "The board will look for weaknesses," he whispered, his breath warm against her temple. "They will try to find the girl beneath the silk. Do not let them. My enemies believe I am silent because I have nothing to say. You will be the proof that my silence was merely a countdown." Zariah looked at herself in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. Gone was the invisible girl with the silver tray. In her place stood a woman who looked like she could dismantle an empire with a single glance. She met Siwoo's eyes in the reflection, seeing the dark pride flickering there. She was his shield and his secret and his most dangerous asset. "And if they ask why you've chosen me," Zariah asked, her voice finding a new, steady edge. Siwoo stepped behind her, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders, his grip a silent promise of protection. "Tell them you found something in me that no one else could." The transition from the dressing suite to the main operations hub felt like walking into the nervous system of Seoul itself. As Zariah stepped onto the reinforced glass floor of the command center, her heels clicked with a newfound weight. Behind her, the door hissed shut, sealing them in a cocoon of flickering monitors and low-frequency static. Siwoo didn't go to the head of the long obsidian table. Instead, he moved toward the panoramic window, his silhouette cutting a sharp, dark line against the neon veins of the city below. "You need to understand the tether," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly low that vibrated through the earpiece he'd just given her. He didn't turn around, but a screen to Zariah's left flared to life, displaying a complex orbital map. A pulsing red dot sat directly over their coordinates. "There is a satellite, Project Icarus, controlled by a faction that wants the Choi Syndicate dismantled. It uses thermal and acoustic signatures to track my specific biometric profile. If it locks on, a kinetic strike or a localized hit squad follows within minutes." Zariah's breath hitched as she watched the red pulse. "And the chip?" "The chip under my tongue is a localized scrambler," Siwoo explained, finally turning to face her. The teal light in his mouth flickered, casting a ghost-like glow on his lips. "It creates a 10-foot dead zone. Anything within that radius is invisible to the sky. But because you triggered the emergency biometric lock, the scrambler now requires a dual-frequency heart rate to stay active, yours and mine." He crossed the room, the distance between them shrinking until he was standing directly in her space. The monitor behind him turned green, indicating a stable link. "If you move more than 10 feet away from me, the scrambler loses its secondary frequency, the dead zone collapses, the satellite finds me, and the mute monster becomes a target in an open field." Zariah looked at the digital tether visualized on the screen, a glowing golden thread connecting two dots. One was him, the other was her. 10 feet, she whispered, the reality of the contract settling in her gut. "I can't even go to a different room?" "Not without me," Siwoo replied, his gaze intense and unblinking. He reached out, his hand hovering near the small of her back, not quite touching but asserting his presence. "You are my shadow now, Zariah. My life is quite literally in your hands, and your life is shielded by my proximity. We are two halves of a single ghost." Zariah looked out at the city, realizing that the shimmering lights of Seoul were no longer just a backdrop to her labor. They were a battlefield, and she was the only thing keeping the commander invisible. She took a half step closer to him, watching the golden thread on the screen shorten. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was a pact of survival. The training room was a minimalist expanse of white mats and recessed lighting, a sterile sanctuary buried deep within the penthouse. Here, the hum of the city was replaced by the rhythmic thud of Zariah's bare feet against the floor. Si-woo had discarded his bespoke blazer, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with lean muscle and a sprawling, intricate tattoo of a dragon that disappeared beneath his collar. "The 10-foot rule is a luxury we won't always have in a fight," Si-woo said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to anchor Zariah to the spot. "If a strike breaks the perimeter, you need to know how to move within my space, not away from it." He stepped toward her, invading her guard with the fluid grace of a predator. He didn't use a weapon, he used his body. He caught her wrist, spinning her around until her back was pressed flush against his chest. The proximity was a physical jolt. Zariah could feel the heat radiating through his shirt, the steady, rhythmic drum of his heart echoing the pulse of the biometric link humming in her ear. "Elbows in," he murmured, his breath ghosting against the shell of her ear. He reached around, his large hands covering hers to guide her into a defensive posture. His skin was warm, his touch surprisingly gentle despite the lethal strength she knew he possessed. "Weight on the balls of your feet. Use my center of gravity as your own." Zariah tried to focus on the technique, but the scent of him, sandalwood and expensive tobacco, was making her head swim. As she moved to strike, he pivoted with her, their limbs intertwining in a dance that felt less like combat and more like a confession. In the mirrored walls of the gym, she saw them, the Jamaican maid in her training gear and the Korean boss, their bodies a single blurred silhouette of charcoal and caramel. She turned in her arms, her breath hitching as her chest brushed his. For a second, the training stopped. Si-woo's hands didn't drop. They slid from her wrists to her waist, pulling her a fraction of an inch closer. The teal light under his tongue flickered with a sudden, sharp intensity, reflecting the darkening of his eyes. "You're learning fast," he whispered, his thumb grazing the silk of his waistband. Zariah looked up at him, her heart racing not from the exertion, but from the realization that the language of hands had changed. The distance between them was now measured in heartbeats, not feet. "I have a good teacher," she replied, her voice barely a breath. Si-woo didn't pull away. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, the silent boss finally letting the tension of the Syndicate drop. In the quiet of the safe floor, the digital tether wasn't a cage anymore. It was a bridge. The transition from the gym back to the executive wing was seamless, but the atmosphere had shifted. Si-woo was pulled into an emergency video conference with the Syndicate's regional directors, leaving Zariah to wait in the adjoining lounge. To any observer, she was the special strategist, reviewing data on a tablet. But as the minutes ticked by, Zariah felt the old instincts of the maid, the woman who had learned to be a ghost in the corners of the ultra-wealthy, begin to tingle. She stood up, pacing the perimeter of the 10-foot tether. As Si-woo's voice, low and commanding, drifted through the frosted glass of the conference room, Zariah noticed a flicker of movement in the reflection of a polished obsidian vase. It was Park, Si-woo's most trusted security lieutenant, standing in the shadows of the service corridor, a place he had no reason to be. Zariah didn't confront him. Instead, she leaned into the invisibility she had worn like a second skin for years. She softened her posture, lowered her gaze, and moved with the silent, rhythmic step of someone meant to be overlooked. She drifted toward the ventilation grate near the service door, her heart hammering against the silk of her power suit. Through the slats, the hushed, hurried whispers of Park and a second voice, the Syndicate's treasurer, filtered through with chilling clarity. "The satellite lock is failing," the treasurer hissed. "Every time we try to ping his biometric signature, it hits a dead zone. The scrambler has been modified." "It's the woman," Park replied, his voice laced with venom. "The maid he's dressed up in silk. She's the anchor. If we can't break the scrambler, we break her. Once she's out of the 10-foot radius, the Icarus satellite will have a clear shot. We move during the masquerade. When the signal jams, she's a ghost." Zariah's blood ran cold. The betrayal wasn't coming from a rival syndicate. It was coming from the very men standing guard outside the door. They hadn't realized that the mute monster could now hear everything through her eyes and ears. She turned back toward the glass doors of the study, her movements precise and deliberate. She didn't look like a terrified maid. She looked like the strategist she was pretending to be. When Siwoo stepped out of his meeting, his dark eyes immediately sought hers, checking the digital tether. Zariah didn't speak. She simply walked into his space, her hand resting on his forearm in a way that looked like affection to a stranger, but felt like a warning to him. She leaned in, her curls brushing his jaw, and whispered into the earpiece. "The mole isn't outside the house, Siwoo. He's holding your keys." Siwoo's jaw tightened. The teal light under his tongue flared with a dangerous, steady glow. He didn't look at the corridor where Park was hiding. He only looked at Zariah, his silent partner, who had just proven that the most powerful weapon in the penthouse wasn't a gun. It was the woman they had all forgotten to notice. The grand ballroom of the Latte Hotel was a sea of shimmering silk and porcelain masks, a kaleidoscope of Seoul's elite bathed in the artificial glow of neon accents. Zariah felt the weight of her silver masquerade mask, a delicate filigree that mimicked the curls of her hair, but it was nothing compared to the weight of the secret she carried. Beside her, Siwoo was a phantom in black velvet, his own mask a sharp, angular raven that made his dark eyes look like obsidian. "Stay within the shadow of my step." Siwoo's voice vibrated through her earpiece, barely a ghost of a sound over the swelling orchestral music. "The air is thin tonight." Zariah scanned the room, her maid-trained eyes catching the subtle shifts in the crowd. She saw Park standing near the champagne fountain, his hand hovering too close to his inner jacket pocket. She saw the treasurer nodding to a group of men in the balcony. The tether on her wrist monitor glowed a steady gold, 8 feet, safe. Then the world flickered. A high-pitched whine, audible only to those wearing the Syndicate's tech, pierced Zariah's ear. The golden thread on her monitor turned a frantic, bleeding red before vanishing entirely. The neon lights of the ballroom hummed and died, plunging the gala into a terrifying velvet darkness. "The signal is jammed," Zariah gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. "Siwoo, the satellite." "I know," he growled. The digital dead zone had collapsed. Without the scrambler, Siwoo was a beacon for the Icarus satellite, and the mole's hit squad was already moving. In the chaos of gasping socialites, a shadow detached itself from the pillar to their left, a blade glinting in the dim emergency light. Siwoo didn't reach for a device or a remote. He stepped in front of Zariah, his movement so primal and fast it lacked the elegance of the gym. It was raw, predatory force. He caught the assassin's wrist in mid-air, the sound of snapping bone echoing through the sudden silence. With a low, guttural snarl, Siwoo drove his shoulder into the man's chest, sending him crashing into a table of crystal. He didn't stop. He pivoted, catching a second attacker with a spinning kick that sent the man sprawling across the marble floor. There was no tech to hide him now, no silence to mask his intent. Siwoo fought with the ferocity of a man who had spent 3 years holding back an ocean of rage. He stayed within inches of Zariah, his palms sweating but his grip unbreakable. "The exit," he commanded, his voice no longer a whisper but a roar that cut through the panic. "Now." As they sprinted toward the service stairs, the first red laser dot from the satellite above flickered against the ballroom floor, searching for its target. Siwoo threw his velvet jacket over Zariah's head, tucking her under his arm as they dove into the shadows of the stairwell, escaping the light by a fraction of a second. The safe house was a brutalist concrete bunker, hidden beneath an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Incheon, a world away from the neon-soaked luxury of the latte. The only sound was the hum of a backup generator and the heavy, ragged breathing of 2 people who had just outrun the sky. Zariah sat on the edge of a steel cot, her silver mask discarded on the floor like a piece of shrapnel. Beside her, Siwoo was stripped to his undershirt, his knuckles bruised and his dragon tattoo glistening with sweat in the dim amber light. The biometric link had finally stabilized, the golden thread on Zariah's monitor glowing steady once more. But the silence between them was different now. It wasn't the silence of the mute monster. It was the silence of a man who had been forced to reclaim a part of himself he had tried to bury. "Why?" Zariah asked, her voice small in the vast cold room. "The chip, the scrambler, it's more than just security, isn't it? You could have used a handheld device. You chose to put it there. You chose to be silent." Siwoo stayed quiet for a long moment, his head bowed. Then he looked at her, and the teal light under his tongue flickered with a weary, rhythmic pulse. He reached up, touching his throat where a faint, jagged scar peeked out from beneath the collar of his shirt, a detail Zariah had never been close enough to see. 3 years ago, during the coup, he began, his voice a gravelly rasp that seemed to hurt him. They didn't just want the Syndicate. They wanted my confession. They wanted me to name every contact, every bank, every life I held in my hands. They used a frequency-based neural inducer, a device that turns your own voice into a weapon against your brain. Every word I spoke triggered a shock that felt like glass shattering in my skull. Zariah's breath hitched. She reached out, her fingers ghosting over his hand. "I realized that if I didn't speak, they had nothing," he continued, his gaze fixed on the concrete floor. "I survived by becoming a ghost. I put the scrambler under my tongue as a physical seal, a reminder that my voice was the only thing they couldn't take if I never gave it. But the silence, it became a cage, Zariah. I forgot how to be anything else." He looked at her then, his eyes raw and searching. "Until I had to say your name to keep you from dying." Zariah didn't pull away. She moved closer, invading the 10-foot perimeter until she was close enough to feel the heat of his skin. She placed her hand over his heart, feeling the steady, thrumming rhythm that now belonged to both of them. "You're not a ghost anymore, Siwoo," she whispered, "and you don't have to hide your voice to keep your power. You just have to trust someone else to help you carry it." In the shadows of the bunker, the mute monster leaned into her touch, his forehead resting against hers, the seal finally, truly broken. The return to the Choi estate wasn't the homecoming Zariah had hoped for. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and wet pavement as a summer storm broke over Seoul. But the thunder wasn't just coming from the clouds. As they stepped into the grand foyer, the lights flickered and died. Not a jammer this time, but a full-scale breach. The silent war had finally arrived at their doorstep. Park didn't just want the chip, Siwoo hissed, his hand instantly finding Zariah's waist to maintain the golden tether. He wanted to hand the entire estate over to the rivals while we were distracted. Red emergency lights bathed the marble in a bloody hue. Shadows moved against the glass walls, men in tactical gear, the rival Syndicate's cleanup crew. Siwoo drew a sleek, suppressed handgun from a hidden compartment in the foyer's wall, his movements precise and lethal. But as they retreated toward the secure elevators, a flashbang detonated near the kitchen entrance, the white light blinding Zariah and tearing her hand from Siwoo's grip. The tether on her monitor screamed a warning. Distance, 9 feet, 10 feet, link unstable. Zariah tumbled backward into the industrial kitchen, her ears ringing. Through the haze, she saw a shadow looming over her, an assassin, his face obscured by a gas mask, a combat knife raised for a silent kill. Her hand clawed at the counter, searching for anything to defend herself. Her fingers brushed against something familiar, something cold and metallic. It was a heavy, circular, silver serving tray. The tool of her invisible life, the symbol of her years in the shadows, felt balanced and strangely right in her hand. As the assassin lunged, Zariah didn't scream. She channeled every ounce of the language of hands training Siwoo had given her. She swung the tray with a guttural cry of defiance, the heavy edge catching the man squarely under his chin. The crack of bone was sickeningly satisfying. She didn't stop. As a second man rounded the corner, she used the tray as a shield, deflecting a blow before driving the rim into his throat. She wasn't a maid anymore. She was the strategist of her own survival. "Zariah!" Siwoo's voice roared through the smoke. She dove through the kitchen door, the silver tray still clutched in her hand like a dented buckler, and collided with his chest just as the monitor turned from red back to a steady, triumphant gold. Siwoo didn't waste a second. He fired 3 rounds over her shoulder, clearing the hallway, before pulling her into the reinforced safety of the elevator. He looked down at her, his eyes wide as they landed on the blood-spattered silver tray. A slow, dark smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first real smile she had ever seen. "I told you," he whispered, his voice thick with pride. "You have a talent for finding the things others overlook." 14 months later, the only sound in the penthouse was the gentle clink of silverware and the low hum of the city waking up below. The red emergency lights and the smell of ozone were a fading memory, replaced by the scent of Blue Mountain coffee and the quiet luxury of a life reclaimed. Zariah stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the master suite, no longer wearing the navy blue cotton of a servant or the rigid silk of a strategist's disguise. She wore a simple white robe, her natural curls free and falling over her shoulders, her skin glowing in the soft dawn light. The digital tether on her wrist was gone. The golden thread that had once been a cage had been deactivated months ago, once the mole was purged and the Icarus satellite was brought under Si-woo's exclusive control. "You're thinking about the silver tray again," a voice rumbled behind her. It was a voice that no longer hesitated, no longer rasped with the pain of the past. Si-woo stepped into her space, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. He didn't need a 10-foot radius to keep him safe anymore, yet he rarely chose to be further than a heartbeat away. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his gaze following hers out toward the horizon where the sun was beginning to ignite the Seoul skyline. "I was thinking about the silence," Zariah replied, leaning back into the solid warmth of his chest. "How much I used to hate it, and how much I love it now, because it's a choice." Si-woo turned her in his arms, his dark eyes searching hers with an intensity that still made her pulse skip. He reached into the pocket of his robe and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside sat a ring, not a digital chip or a high-tech link, but a band of black gold set with a single brilliant teal diamond that matched the glow of the secret they had once shared. "I spent years using silence as a shield," Si-woo said, his voice a steady, beautiful promise. "But with you, I want to use my voice for something else. I want to build something that doesn't require a scrambler to survive." He slid the ring onto her finger, the weight of it a permanent anchor. Zariah looked at her hand, then up at the man who had gone from her mute monster to her partner. She was no longer the daughter of a nurse scrubbing floors to pay off a ghost's debt. She was a woman who had found her power in a 3-second decision and her home in the heart of a king. "We have a meeting with the board at 10, she reminded him, a playful smile tugging at her lips. Si-woo kissed her forehead, his grip tightening with a possessive, protective grace. "Let them wait. Today, the only person I have to answer to is standing right here." They stood together at the edge of the world they had conquered, two halves of a single resonant truth, looking out over a city that finally knew their names. Real power isn't in money, weapons, or reputation. It's in the people you choose to trust and protect. Zariah steps out of her invisible role to make a dangerous, compassionate choice, and that single act reshapes an empire. Si-woo, who once used silence as a shield, learns that hiding behind fear and control is weaker than sharing his burden with someone who sees him as human, not a monster.